Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and today we're discussing supply chain disruption and the legal implications of the current breakdown of supply chains. With Christmas fast approaching, some people are now realizing that Santa might be late this year. Their gifts may not arrive on time. Others have noticed months-long delays in the delivery of large items like furniture or sky-high prices for certain raw goods like lumber. What is behind the disruption of supply chains across Canada and across the world? How long should we expect these disruptions to last, and what are the legal implications? Here today to discuss this issue are two trade lawyers. George Reed is a trade lawyer at Bennett Jones, and Martha Harrison is a trade lawyer at McCarthy Tétrault. Thank you both so much for joining me today. Now, Martha, I want to start with you. From 10,000 feet up, what is the cause of these trade disruptions?
It's actually a perfect storm between any number of trade and commercial issues, starting potentially or probably with the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact that it had, particularly on manufacturing at the outset of the pandemic in China, and the ripple effects that that caused on the supply chain environment across the world. If we use an example of a particular good that has been meaningfully impacted by the supply chain and how that good itself has sort of reverberated down the chain, we can use the supply chain shortage of semiconductors or microchips as an example. According to Acer, for example, one of the world's largest laptop manufacturers, companies are still going to be impacted by this shortage until at least the first half of 2022. And semiconductors are an essential part of electronic devices found in everything from cars to factory machinery to dishwashers and mobile phones. And when we all started working from home, when children started doing online learning, the crunch in that particular product became more dramatic because we required additional technology in order to continue the economic streams in our societies. We also look at some strain on the ports, some container shortage issues, and general economic downturn that was initially caused by COVID. So this is all a perfect storm that has caused this supply chain crunch.
Yeah, George, is there anything you want to add to that about what is feeding this? Because I think there have been some comments from some political leaders saying, this is really about people ordering too much stuff on Amazon. And as Martha said, obviously there's a lot more to it than that. So what are some of the things that you view as fueling this shortage?
Well, I think it's correct in part to say increased demand due to the pandemic is driving a lot of the issues that we're seeing today. But you're absolutely right that there's other factors that we need to take into account. And I'll give two examples. I think the first and most important one is labor, right? We have industries, logistics, transportation, warehousing, where you have all these workers who are now, working increased hours, risking exposure to COVID, especially in the early days of the pandemic, to, get the goods where they needed to go. And, while that might be receding to a certain extent, there's still general labor shortages out there. Manufacturers have a hard time filling slots. And I think the other thing we need to point out is that the strain and the stretches on the supply chains have made them susceptible to other shocks. So the best examples being extreme weather events. I mean, look at the flooding in BC right now. Rail lines in the port, they're going to be out for at least days. There were the wildfires in BC earlier in the year that caused issues. And the winter storm in Texas, right? That knocked out supply of critical foam that goes into upholstered furniture, right? There was also resin production impacted, which goes into plastics to make cars. So we talk about the perfect storm. In some cases, it's literally a storm.
Martha, just briefly, we've got a minute left in this segment. Your comments on how COVID has fueled any of these shortages. In particular, I think there was a port shutdown in Asia because of a COVID outbreak there.
Right. So port processes have been dramatically impacted by COVID. Where we have a port that has labor shortages or labor reductions because of exposure to COVID, in many instances, the port management has not been able to substitute staffing quickly enough. And there have been actual port shutdowns, as you mentioned, Christine, resulting from the COVID contraction or COVID exposure. We have similar additional stressors on ports because of the container shortage and because of related regulatory issues that are straining the to and from and transportation internationally.
We've got to go to break, Martha, but we'll continue this when we're back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing supply chain disruption and the legal implications. Now, Martha, contracts govern here in these relationships, but obviously this crisis was not foreseen when these contracts were negotiated originally. No one anticipated COVID. So what does that mean for consumers or for suppliers? And would any of the things that are happening right now, including the storms in British Columbia, would this constitute force majeure under a contract?
That's a good question. And there's no doubt that a lot of ink has been spilled in the legal sector around the issue of force majeure clauses, which are also tied to the concept of contract frustration. Both entail the notion that the contract or certain parts of the contract cannot or will not be fulfilled under particularly urgent circumstances. So generally speaking, a force majeure is an event where that cannot be controlled or anticipated necessarily by either party. So it's an unexpected event that prevents someone from doing or completing something in respect of the contract that they have agreed to do. And usually we think about emergency issues such as what are often called acts of gods, natural disasters, floods, hurricanes, and acts of people like riots, strikes, wars, etc. And so whether or not the COVID pandemic fits squarely into a force majeure clause has been the subject of much discussion. I would say that the pandemic itself would not constitute sort of an excuse under a force majeure, but potentially the implications of the pandemic would allow for a party to exit an obligation if it falls under their force majeure clauses. For example, what has the pandemic caused or not caused to happen that is preventing a party from performing the functions? As we talked about earlier, as George mentioned, labor shortages, for example, or a goods shortage, or if you are supported by an entity above or below you in a supply chain, and one of them is having struggles with their ability to procure goods or services. So potentially the impact of COVID might constitute a force majeure, but it is unclear that the pandemic itself would be. And so when we're looking at working around the problem or how entities should deal with this moving forward, it's really about finding practical commercial arrangements that would allow them to identify additional sources of supply, for example, or creating opportunities to renegotiate the contract if required.
Exactly. That's sort of what I want to ask you about now, George. How do purchasers and suppliers deal with these delays without necessarily having to resort to a legal dispute? Since these supply contracts, these relationships are usually not one-offs, and suppliers and purchasers rely on one another. How do you resolve these things without having to go to court or an arbitrator?
Well, I think paramount importance here is that there's a very strong incentive, especially while COVID pandemic conditions remain in effect, to maintain those relationships. Because frankly, another part of this supply chain story is that not only is it hard to get goods in and out of country, it's hard to get people in and out of countries, right? And supply chains run on people, right? You're not going to go buy a huge order from a factory you've never seen or toured or assured yourself that the quality controls are correct. So if you're having troubles with your supplier, you're not going to go run off and find an alternative source of supply. You're constrained in your ability to do that. So the incentive is really to come to some sort of an agreement. And a lot of players, everybody's aware of what the conditions are, right? Everybody knows that it's hard to move the goods and there's shortages. So open communication is absolutely key. Some of the things that we've seen in the past months, a supplier might put its various customers on allocation. We can only deliver you so much product within a certain amount of time in light of the various constraints. We've also seen some suppliers prioritize some customers over others because some relationships may be more important to the bottom line than others.
Now we've got about a minute left, George, but some purchasers have been imposing so-called fines on their suppliers for failing to deliver things on time. What can you tell me about that?
So typically in a contract, at the time of negotiation, you can predetermine an amount of what's known as liquidated damages for a failure to deliver on time. So that might be a certain sum of money that is paid for every day that the delivery is late. We typically see these types of damages clause, liquidated damages clause, in two scenarios. One is where you have a very, very powerful purchaser, big national, international chain will have the purchasing power to force smaller suppliers to accept these liquid damages clause.
George, before you get to the second one, we've got to go to commercial break, but I want you to finish that up after that break. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing supply chain disruption and the legal implications. Now, before the break, George, I'd asked you about how some purchasers have been imposing fines on suppliers who have failed to deliver on time. You told me that those are typical in sort of two scenarios. The first is when one is a large, powerful party, where one of the purchasers is a large, powerful party. And what was that second scenario?
So the second scenario depends on the nature of the goods itself and the industry practice. So for instance, capital projects in the construction industry where certain materials need to arrive by a certain time in order to facilitate the overall project schedule, it's not uncommon to see a liquidated damages clause in those specific scenarios. But generally, when you have sort of negotiating parity between a purchaser and a supplier, it's quite uncommon to see those types of liquidated damages clauses.
Now, it's interesting to me that it's not that common because we have been for a long time now in the era of just-in-time manufacturing. So a lot of manufacturers require the delivery of goods at a very specified time so that they can get those products out. George, do you think that this crisis is going to have an impact on just-in-time manufacturing in the future?
I definitely think that it is an issue that needs to be looked at very carefully. The pandemic has really exposed a big weakness in just-in-time manufacturing, and it's apparently called the Pacific Ocean. It's a big issue when you have an inability to deliver things on time. That said, I think that there is a view in the business community that things are going to go more or less back to the way they were, that we will be able to go back to just in time. And let's just recall, just in time means, you forecast your demand and your needs for inputs and you order accordingly so that you're not holding inventory, tying up capital, and, has a number of financial benefits. The issue going forward is, are we going to see a modified form of just-in-time with strategic reserves of inventory? Again, I suspect it's going to be different depending on the industry, right? So if your inputs have a best before date, likely you're still going to want to go back to a just-in-time model, right? If you're in, for instance, say the auto manufacturing industry, you may decide that a strategic approach to carrying inventory is the best way to protect against future shocks.
Now, Martha, there have been some big firms, some big companies that have taken some actions themselves to supply secure their own supply chains. What can you tell me about those actions, and if that's something you'd recommend that companies do if they can?
Yeah, I think that often, as is often the case, there's power in sort of larger corporations and in many instances where larger multi-corporations are able to sort of take charge of their sources of supply, it's a little bit easier from an economic perspective than for small and medium-sized enterprises from doing the same. For example, large retailers are actually now rerouting ships to less used ports because they can. They're also hiring new workers that are unloading cargo during off hours and switching to air freight, and in some cases, as opposed to rail, ship, or truck where possible. Those are all constructive means to address the issues that larger corporations can do because they have the economic benefit of being able to do so. The other strategy being employed by both small, medium, and larger scale enterprises is investment in IT. There are a number of really diversified IT solutions that can support supply chain management and that can facilitate procurement strategies. And procurement strategies in the supply chain context now is more complex than it ever has been before. And these tech solutions support companies in finding cost savings and also in finding diversification strategies that are possible to find within that supply chain continuum. For smaller companies, for example, it's really been about watching inventory levels and knowing when to stock up, so anticipating demand and knowing when to sell through. It's about order splitting between two or more companies as opposed to relying on one source of supply. And frankly, it's really about conversations with insurance companies to understand what products that are available to cover some of that financial strain, and having these important relationships with your suppliers or with company suppliers to understand where there can be a push-pull in that relationship.
Lots of good advice for companies if they're looking to make some moves to deal with these delays. When we get back from this commercial break, I want to talk about some broader trade issues and what this is going to mean, the Buy American, Buy Canadian mentality, if that's going to grow as a result of these trade disruptions. We will be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice. We are discussing supply chain disruption and its legal implications. Now, these supply chain disruptions it seems to be contributing to a sort of trade nationalism, Buy American, Buy Canadian. We've seen the launch of the new infrastructure bill in the United States. We have seen a lot of trade issues that arose out of the Trump presidency. What can you say about that, George, about what this pandemic, what these delays have unleashed with respect to trade nationalism?
Well, it's quite interesting because the two issues in some respects are quite separate, right? We have the kind of new world of international trade that was unleashed by the Trump administration, right? A renewed reliance on tariffs as a policy tool of economic nationalism. Now we're in a situation where the interest really is on having a strong North American integrated economy to facilitate nearshoring. We have a brand new trade agreement, the CUSMA, which is really meant to facilitate and help that process along. So in certain respects, you're seeing, trade policy and the response to the pandemic working a bit at cross purposes in that respect, right? You have infrastructure bills in the U.S. that are focused on increasing the Buy American thresholds on public procurement contracts in the United States. You've got the electronic vehicle credit. Prime Minister Trudeau was politely rebuffed, I believe is one way of describing it, yesterday on his attempts to influence President Biden. So, we're at a time when coordination and cooperation is absolutely essential to, strengthen and improve the resiliency of our supply chains. And yet trade policy is pulling that away, right? Trade policy has become a much more confrontational idea right now. And that's sort of where the cross purposes come in.
Martha, I want your take on this. Do you think that the supply chain disruption is going to fuel these trade nationalist sentiments, the Buy American, Buy Canadian sentiments? And do you think it's going to increase and reinforce the notion that manufacturers have about nearshoring their supply chain instead of having it overseas?
Yeah, well, I think that generally speaking, nearshoring is certainly a strategy that is becoming more important as the days and months go by through this pandemic in particular. If we're looking at the concept of buy American versus buy Canadian, I think that it's a policy divide, which doesn't necessarily coincide with the commercial reality. Generally speaking, Canada is always going to be relying very, very heavily on the US as our main market source for exports. 75% of Canadian exports are destined to the United States, and over 50% of our imports are coming from the United States. So the concept of nearshoring for a Canadian enterprise often means making sure that it has enough eggs in the US basket to keep that supply chain continuum and that momentum going. Where the rubber can hit the road is if the Buy American policies, for example, are impacting or interfering with the Canadian importer or investor in the US with their ability to proceed with their business accordingly. And that's where the commercial enterprises in Canada are going to rely on the Canadian government to continue these hopeful negotiations with the Biden administration. As George mentioned, it feels like there was limited success in the meetings that the parties of the USMCA, so Canada, Mexico, and United States have had over the last couple of days in terms of achieving concessions by President Biden in respect of the Buy American policies. But nearshoring will continue to be an important strategy. A couple things to consider when it comes to nearshoring.
Martha, unfortunately, that is all the time that we have left, but I want to thank you both so much for coming on the show today and sharing your insight. We've heard today about supply chain chaos around the world, rising prices for raw goods, container shortages, crowded ports, and shipping and trucking shortages. COVID shutdowns are also contributing to delays, as is overall increased consumer demand for more products. While we know the delays are causing some legal challenges for both suppliers and purchasers, ultimately it's the consumers who will suffer through shortages and higher prices. Is this crisis going to change the way manufacturers operate? Will it change just-in-time logistics or increase trade nationalism and lead to more buy American or buy Canadian sentiment? You be the judge. Thanks for watching, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.